Hello from Bernheim. Hope you all are safe.
Hi from Bernheim.
Hi from Bernheim Forest.
Hi from Bernheim.
Hi from Bernheim.
Hi from Bernheim Arboretum.
Peace from Bernheim.
Hi from Bernheim Arboretum and Research Forest.
Hi from Bernheim.
Hello from Bernheim Forest.
Hi from Bernheim Forest.
Hi from Bernheim. I'm Rick Caldwell, and I hope you have a great day.
Hello from Bernheim.
Hey from Bernheim.
Good afternoon. I'm Richard Duran, the Association's Marketing and Communications Manager. The Dorothy E. Hansel Marketing Award is a tribute to a woman who stood for excellence in horticultural and botanical journalism. Hansel was editor of the New York Botanical Gardens Garden Journal, the newsletter and bulletin of the Holly Society of America, the American Bonsai Society Journal, and the APGA Bulletin. This award recognizes an outstanding marketing and communications campaign that powerfully advances a public gardens mission. The association is pleased to present 2 awards this year. Our first award recognizes the efforts of a garden that survived a direct hit by Hurricane Irma on the Gulf Coast of Florida in 2017. To support a fundraising campaign to help the garden recover, the garden's marketing team created an inspiring and uplifting look to use in all messaging, and a comprehensive marketing campaign emerged, including blogs, e-newsletters, social media posts, digital and print advertising, and 3 Garden Member magazine features. The campaign raised more than $2 million from 526 donors, giving a total of 560 gifts to the garden's recovery efforts. But more importantly, the stewardship of these contributors continues to ensure a sustainable future. The association is proud to present the Dorothy E. Hansel Marketing Award to Naples Botanical Gardens' Replant and Regrow campaign. Our second award recognizes a campaign that advanced the garden's mission to discover and share knowledge about plants and their environment. On a shoestring budget of just $250 in Facebook advertising, plus some staff time, the garden attracted over 7,000 visitors and reached over 100,000 through social media in promotion of its first ever Tree Week during the fall of 2018. Even with those impressive numbers, the true measure of Tree Week's success was the attention it drew to the garden's living collection of trees, some of which date back to the garden's founding over 150 years ago. The association is proud to present the Dorothy E. Hansel Marketing Award to Missouri Botanical Gardens Tree Week.
Greetings from Mendocino Coast Botanical Gardens. Hope you're having a good time and wish you were here.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Beck, Director of Programs and Education at the American Public Gardens Association. I will be your staff representative during this virtual conference session. Before we begin, here are a couple of tips to get the most out of your virtual conference experience. First, if you're experiencing poor video quality or audio quality, we suggest closing other programs on your computer, especially other browser tabs. Your inbox will still be there at the end of the session, I promise. If you have any other problems or questions, association staff are available to help. Give us a call at 610-708-3010 or send us an email at info@publicgardens.org. Second, while this session has been pre-recorded, the presenters are here with us today as panelists and will be happy to take your questions in the live question and answer portions of the session. At some point during this session, the presenters may activate a poll. Poll responses are anonymous, so be sure to let us know how you really feel. Finally, you can submit your questions using Zoom's Q&A function that you will find in your Zoom toolbar. Questions can be submitted anonymously. You can also upvote other questions to indicate you would like to hear them answered. We will try to answer as many questions as we can during the live Q&A portion of this session. Some questions may be answered directly through the Q&A feature. Thank you, and enjoy today's session.
Well, hello everyone. It's a great pleasure being with you today. It's not quite the format we were hoping for, but I'm so glad, thanks to Sarah and her whole team, at least we can communicate, which is wonderful in those times, and not forget about each other for whole other years. So I'm really excited to be here with you. And so when submitting, for different lectures and presentation, it was kind of quite a few months ago. And so what I want to do with you today is kind of frame that question and walk you through some projects that I think could be very relevant to kind of illustrate that big question I wanted to share with you as part of this presentation. So let me give you just a couple words about who I am. You may have noticed I've got a bit of an accent. I'm French originally, but I've been in the US for over 20 years. I'm a landscape architect. My name is Emmanuel Didier, and my background was in art. And when moving to the United States, I went to UVA, I did architecture, landscape architecture. And anyhow, over those years, after living in Boston, and I discovered a passion for landscape architecture and botanical garden. I've been practicing since about 2002, so almost 20 years, and got a great passion for public gardens in particular. I was lucky enough, I worked for Susan Child, originally in Boston, who already had that passion. She was the first one who took me to the New York Botanical Garden. And then worked with Herb Shaw, who's now retired, but was with Edo, and I'd done a lot of public gardens and children's gardens across the nation. So I worked with him and learned a lot from him. And then I opened my own practice in 2010. And I kind of flapped my own wings since then, and worked with many of you across the country. And so it's just fun for me to take the time to reflect a little bit on some of the things I've learned and working with you all, and just open up some questions. And in some ways, I know we're kind of a big family of mostly you horticulture teams and people working directly with public gardens. I'm a little bit different, where I'm a designer, so I'm more a consultant, but in some ways, I think my first conference was in Washington, DC 10 years ago or more, and I haven't missed one. This year I tried to not miss it, but forces were against us. Anyway, I'm just excited to be with you all today, and I hope we can engage with some conversation. And I don't know under which format we will have any follow-up, but that's something we can always talk about later. So let me give you a little bit of a 2 cents on who I am and my maybe philosophy or approach of what I care about most when I think about design. And one of the key words I like to use is place rather than landscape, and then the other one is making. And I just want to tell you a couple of things about it. And what's interesting about the word landscape, it's kind of that land that you look at from inside outside. And I feel like, to me, it's a little bit too much of a static word, the word landscape. And when I think of what I'm doing, I'm more about crafting places, and places are much more of a dynamic, three-dimensional environment that brings in geography, history, culture, how people inhabit that place. And place is always in motion. And so the way I see our work is always as if the place is already on a journey and we come in and we just affect its trajectory. So to design, to me, is really an action. It's kind of transformation and changing things. So when I work with you, that's kind of what we do. We kind of look at under which values do we work together and how do we affect change. And then one of my professors when I went to UVA was Beth Meyer. She's one of the main theorists, and she really kind of inspired that vision in some ways by always talking about you're not coming in by imposing something over the land, but you're kind of working with the land and listening to the land. And that's something I want to talk about today when we talk about what does that mean to inspire resiliency. So that question, I phrased it that way, inspiring resiliency in a changing world. And that was kind of aligning a little bit this lecture with the format and the overall theme of the APGA conference, to be in Portland, but to be from home. And, we could go on and on about what it means to define place and all those things. But what's interesting also, in our time of really talking about the stress and climate and the evolution of climate and the disruption it does to wildlife and plant species and all living creatures, really, it's kind of amazing this year, the effects of COVID and what it does to our perception of the landscape. And I think that what's interesting in that's one little article that I gleaned actually from a LinkedIn. I think someone published it. It was interesting to see how many New York Times and all kinds of social media those days, people are really reevaluating what nature does to them. So I do feel like part of what I was excited to talk about today is you guys being public garden is, I think, how much you come at a very critical time and how much chance you have to affect change of how we behave or inhabit this land. And I feel like there's so much progress to be done, but I think there's a new awareness and perception and sensibility toward why it matters to care better for the living world. So anyway, that's kind of to quote here, it says, these natural spaces are suddenly getting the respect and attention they deserve because we're now beginning to comprehend just how badly we need them. I feel like that was kind of powerful to just remind that. And the other thing I noticed also, a lot of people, I was asking some of the nurseries we work with whether they're busy, and it's just amazing to see that people instead have been they couldn't wait to go buy plants and do their own garden. So there's that sense of a stronger connection to the landscape. And here is a picture of a friend of mine the other day. Denver is going through a tree urban forest initiative, and it's just a sad story. And you almost think it's a bonsai of an oak tree. And but it's just, there's so much research since on why do we need to connect to nature, and the fact that the urban environment has caused so much stress that people kind of see now value of why you would do that for the health and well-being of everyone. So I think all those research are very important. And then, I know we talk always about Richard Louv, is like there's not one single APGA conference to Richard Louv, and I'm sorry to bring him up again. It's an interesting voice. I think he was very able to use everyday words and find very strong sentences or quotes that just vibrate with everybody's kind of sensibility to why they care about nature. So I think that's why we talk so much about him. However, in this case, why I wanted to bring him up is that I was invited. We did a master plan with the Desert Botanical Garden in Phoenix. And for the unveiling of the master plan for the Children and Family Garden, they had invited Richard Louv to present and talk about why do we do children's garden. And so I just thought it was interesting because at that day, actually, we had a long conversation and he was able to kind of bring it down to almost a singular question that I want to kind of rephrase with my own words with you as a way of thinking why I think botanical gardens today are such in a powerful, critical position to help inspire people to go toward a more resilient and engaging and actually maybe even more inspiring and fun world. So anyway, 2 words on that project and why he took it as a point of beginning for his lecture was that this is in a desert environment and not so obvious of what it means to create a space that is safe and inspiring for kids to play in nature. When you think of desert, you think scorpions, snakes, tarantulas, cactus. You're pretty much going to get hurt if you go outside. And yet the whole goal of this garden was, how do you make it really compelling and inspiring and rediscover and realizing actually the natural environment in the desert is a lot more complex and rich than just those 3 or 4 things I just mentioned that all have mean ways of defense. So anyway, we did this master plan and those vignettes, and it was all about crafting a very immersive environment where senses are very engaged. It's all about going over things like bridging over an arroyo, framing the arroyo, which is the main ways of drainage into the desert, and sitting by, enjoying shade, going through touching things, smelling things. So your whole body and senses are engaged. And the building, instead of being the centerpiece, when we do those gardens, is more of the edge, and it's framing the natural system. And I think and we use art and thinking how could sculptors and artists be part of a garden like that to kind of tell stories of what's so unique about cactuses, for example, and their ability to suck in water and hold it in the desert. And when it does rain, you have all this color coming out. So there's a sense of joy of water and what it does to senses and life in the desert. So, and it can get pretty messy. This is a centerpiece actually of the whole garden. Is actually a very unstructured space for play and discovery. So I think when he used that project as a kind of point of beginning for his one of the key sentence, from what I remember, those are not his words, it's kind of what I remember of his question, but I love that question. And since for many years now, I've been kind of inhabiting that question. And I want to share with you is why don't we approach the design and planning of our cities the same way we design children's gardens? And I thought that was a beautiful question and not at all obvious, but you could see with the keywords I use, like engaging senses, creating a sense of discovery, a sense of immersion, a feel of contact, and finding social nodes and feel a connection to something greater like nature, and inviting other creatures to inhabit your own territory. Seems like such a beautiful, magical ways of approaching how you could maybe design cities. And this idea is not necessarily new, because if you think of even Olmsted, actually for some wrong reason, like the Central Park was in the news the other day, as very sculpted terrain where people want to enjoy bird watching and things like that. And so I'm not going to go there, but it was just incredible to see that it's kind of a long story, but sometimes we forget on why don't we create more places where people really feel like connected to something else than just their apartment and inside space. So anyway, and I kind of rephrased for today as a way of maybe assigning part of that responsibility of creating new forms of urban landscapes to you guys, to the public garden, and saying, you know, how can public gardens further inspire the transformation of our cities to a more biodiverse and resilient system, to a more engaging and geographically relevant landscape, and to a more fun and culturally diverse sense of place? So those 3 questions, in some ways the first one more related to research and science, which is, I think, one of the key ingredients of how to build stronger systems for the city. That sense of inspiration, being engaging, and a sense of discovery. And also how it kind of maybe goes outbound and goes further out. It doesn't stay within the public garden, but how does that kind of reach out and becomes part of the fabric of the city itself? It's kind of what I would love to challenge you, and maybe as a designer be part of that journey with you and other team members. So I'll start with one key project that we're working on now, which is with the university at Penn State. So in Pennsylvania State College, right in the middle of the state, it was a ag school. And they have a pretty amazing actually center for research on pollinators. And pretty incredible people that were part of the team and really wanting to make a difference. They go and travel the world doing research, doing lectures and all that, but what they didn't have is a place like an arboretum or public garden where they could in some ways display or interpret their research. How do you do research about pollinators? Highlight some key questions, things we don't even know yet about them. And also just give a chance to people understand, make it tangible of what they could do in their own yard to make a difference. Like so many kids, they go to school now and they become aware of that issue with pollinators, but they come home stressed out because there's nobody has an answer of what you can do. So I feel like one of the interesting aspects of this project in some ways is to create a source of inspiration of how, at your own scale, what can you do? And so I just wanted to share a little bit that story with you because to me it's kind of a pretty powerful way of really digging deep into research and be able to address the everyday sense of emergency that we're going through in regard to pollinators. And so lots of press around it. And so the way we had to start was kind of distill so much information, which was pretty challenging actually. And I must say, this project was done with a fairly large team. There's also a phyto design studio is with us doing a lot of the planting and trying to understand how to create those habitats. So even the design phase, I must say, kind of includes a lot of research components in some ways. So anyway, we were trying to gather a lot of those key fundamental principles that are kind of have been guiding the design and sense of priorities of what does it mean to create a pollinator garden? Is it just those 3 iconic flowers and call it good? And realizing that no, it's a lot more complex. And so that's what I want to share with you here. So creating habitats was a huge part of it. So we have about 3.5 acres, which you're looking at in color. And I want to mention also, it's not just a pollinator garden, but they also want to integrate the birds' habitat, which is interesting because they constantly overlap. It's not like we have the bees in one corner, the wasp in one corner, the flies over there, and then the birds. Don't eat the butterfly. No, instead they're going to coexist, and we're within them as well. So people, birds, pollinators, all that, and plants all together. And so the field right now was just a green field, constant slope, fairly uninteresting, I would say. And so the big challenge for us was, how do you transform the site in order to create so much diversity in one small place? And the goal was to even include plants from not just Central Valley, where Penn State is, but go beyond that and to the whole state of Pennsylvania for some aspects of it. What's interesting also with Pennsylvania and why that Center for Research is there is that the agriculture in Pennsylvania, because of the topography, is not so monoculture oriented. There's a lot of fragmented, mosaic-like agriculture, which then creates a lot of hedgerows and diversity. So learning from that landscape, we created a series of ridges and valleys and a way of animating the topography, creating a lot of different soil conditions and scale conditions and exposures to wind, blocking certain wind versus facing eastern light versus facing western light versus being in the shade. And as we did that, it was also a way of not revealing the whole garden at once, which would be overwhelming, but creating a sense of capturing people's attention. One of the things we realized almost day one as a question is, well, how do you know you're in a pollinator garden versus just a garden? And if you think about it, a lot of pollinators are not completely invisible, but most people walk by pollinators and don't even know they just walk by a pollinator. Kids will grab you and say, I saw a butterfly, but most of us are on the cell phone doing too much nonsense and we don't even see the pollinators. So I think the interesting aspect of that was, how do you know you're arriving in a pollinator? So we played with that notion that when you arrive, you have this tilted disc that you see right in the center. It's almost like this earth tilted, and you kind of arrive as if you're arriving from above. And as you move through the garden, you're more and more become immersed into this environment. And what's also interesting about creatures, pollinators, is how much people want to stay away from them. And so we also thought, what does that mean to make it comfortable for people to feel invited even to go into a pollinator? So sculpting the ground plane and really thinking about soil composition, slopes aspects, and really creating those different pockets for different plants and habitats was a key aspect of the design process. The other thing we learned is that if you think of the garden as food, which is really what it is for the pollinators, you can't just feel good by giving lots of food in one time and then take off. And so you have all those pollinators coming, and then if the food goes away, they go away. So in order to keep them and make this a successful pollinator habitat, you realize it needs to be super layered and be very active from early spring all the way through the season. And that's an interesting challenge to think of those layering of constant food coming, which is constant flowering. And then you realize you really have to increase plant diversity. You can't just feel good having few, Rudbeckia and then Echinacea and then call it a pollinator's garden. You really need to expand that floral palette and food and types and what height, when do they bloom. Some bee species, for example, will come mostly early in the morning, so they have to have the flower open then, when others will come later. And so it was just so amazing, pretty challenging to sit at a table with 10, 12 PhDs on pollinations and make sure we make everybody happy. But this is kind of what's being built now. And so it'll be very exciting to see this opening is being built. One of the key things we thought is, how do you tell the stories of all this? How is it that when you come in, you're not overwhelmed with all that research? So really thinking about fragments of stories being told in different aspects of the garden. And in some ways, because you rely on the plants, you realize that you can't have all the stories there at once and all the time. You have to come back and learn again on different things. So those are some of the views, that notion of arrival from a non-pollinator friendly turf environment to a very rich, abundant zone of flowers. This is moving around, and we played with this idea of almost like a monumental gesture of sculpture, that tilted disc, almost that sense of imbalance of the world of pollinators, and realizing that a lot of pollinators live in the ground and nest in the ground, and we don't actually, some bees, we don't even know where they live. It's kind of interesting that we're in 21st century, and we think we know so much about our planet, but a lot of the creatures that we need and rely on for our own agriculture, we don't even know where their house is. And so it's just interesting to realize how powerful it can be to enhance that level of research and knowledge and education for an aspect so essential to our own belonging on this planet. And for us to have food, we need that pollination. So this is kind of the purpose. And as part of the elements of this garden is this little structure, sometimes little folies that really relate and bring people and pollinators together in one space. So this is a little kind of a cooling space where a beehive can be hosted in it. You don't get in contact with a beehive, but you kind of share a space with them. So it's a way of emotionally creating that tie to something that most people don't understand or don't know about and can learn so much. So anyway, that story was really to convey, I think, what's so powerful about botanical gardens today in face of climate change. It has unfortunately almost has become political, where sometimes research is put aside. I think it's powerful to see how you're all able to integrate research at the heart of your institution and then put it on display. And so people don't have to actually read a full 12-chapter book to learn about pollination. They can go through a garden and come back home and share a story about how they suddenly that transform their perspective, their understanding of something pretty essential. So I think that it's a powerful aspect of how can we inspire resilience instead of imposing it on people. How do you inspire people? That, I think, is a fundamental question. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 shows a different project, and some of you may have seen some of those slides before. Is a project we did with the Denver Botanical Gardens. Right in the heart of Denver, at the Step Garden. And I want to talk about this project as an example. I think it's pretty phenomenal what the team there did in terms of curating almost people's experience, as well as hosting a very complex and rich plant collection. And as a way of really inspiring the region on how to transform their perception of values of what they think is beautiful in terms of what the landscape can be in a region. So instead of importing plants from elsewhere, instead of trying to look like something else, letting Denver, which is kind of in the center of the state region, be really recognizant and inspired to use more native plants and plants that are really better, just better for people's use in their own landscape. And so be able to transform the values and what you call beauty, I think is kind of an interesting aspect of this garden. So this project of the step garden was done a few years ago. And the way it started is that for over 12, 15 years, some of the horticulture staff like Mike Bone and others at and PK at the Denver Botanical Garden, incredible team who had been traveling the world and trying to understand the steppe biome. And you know, as a child, I grew up in France, and when I knew of the steppe, I would think of Mongolia and these huge spaces with huge vast land and a huge sky. And I didn't even realize when I moved to Denver that I was going to live in the steppe. I really did not know that. We always call it more of the short prairie grass, or everybody thinks that if you go and live in Colorado, you're going to live in the mountains. And they forget that actually there's this huge ecotone and biome of the steppe landscape. So here's the plan view, and kind of, I'm just going to walk you through the shaping and making of this garden. And here is Mike Bone and taking photos. I don't know if that was maybe in Patagonia. Anyway, the Denver Botanical Garden, just as we were starting this garden, had made this publication coming out. And in some ways, the purpose of the garden is really to create a living collection, hosting most of their research right there so people can really experience it, which is huge, huge aspect of how you take the research into something that is tangible and people can experience it. And then we put this little collage, and it kind of conveys a little bit what's intriguing as the shared character between all of those four regions. There are four regions of where you can find the steppe biome in the world. There's Patagonia, there's Central Asia, there's South Africa, and North America, where we live in. And what's constant, and what those images show, that the steppe biome was created where it's regions in the world where it used to be a seabed, so fairly level, and under the making of mountains, there's a huge shift of energy and uplift. And so these was regions that were lower and more level. So they found themselves very kind of exposed up. And that transformation in geology, also with the tall mountains blocking winds with rainfall, and so creating a very different climate, semi-arid. And what's beautiful about, I think, the steppe landscape is it's really a story about being adaptable and being resilient. At the heart of it, those plants at first were not under different same conditions, and they learn kind of to evolve. And it's interesting to see that some of the plants that you find in each of them look so similar or are similar to the one you can find here around Denver. And so when we started, we had to take this huge landscape, huge sky, large open space. Suddenly we're in the middle of Denver, in the middle of the Denver Botanical Garden. They're surrounded with all the gardens, and there are trees and everything. And so the site is about 1 acre, and it's kind of hot. It was a huge challenge for us. How do you make people feel like they're entering the steppe landscape? So we had to kind of really work hard, and that's kind of what you see is a series of sketching, modeling, to try to understand what it's going to do to take people on a journey through the steppe landscape and feel like really, you know, inspired and fall in love with that landscape, where they would say, gosh, I love this place. It feels like really unique, very here. I want to know more about it. And then that's how you spur a question. I think that's how you spur education about a place, is that you really want to make people fall in love with that place. And so when we did this, and all the modeling and all the drawing, the big goal was to think about creating the perfect terrain that could hold so much diversity for all of those plants at the same time as creating a sense of discovery for people, so you don't enter and look at it almost like a French garden where you are like at one window and you can see it all. Here it's the opposite, where you come in and you never see it all in one place, and you have to explore it to better understand. And so we wanted also to convey the sense that this landscape is related to the fact that the ground swelled up, created a mountain. It's like an unstable ground that is constantly evolving, and that's why those plants are what they are. They had to respond to that transformation. So here is kind of the built landscape, and you can see that we wanted to make sure that when you enter the garden, right away you're aware that something shifted, something kind of is moving, and there's a crack, and there's an upland, there's lowland, and it's a very dynamic landscape. And by creating those shelves, we were able to create some places where you have deep gravel, very low nutrients versus areas where it's more saturated water, very low water. So even it's just 1 acre, when you go in it, you sense it's much larger, and you can host much more diversity of types of plant palettes within that small zone. And you can see at the scale of people, we also look at the height of that terrain so that you block views and you force people to have to move around to discover that garden. At the same time, we are worried about, we have those big cottonwood trees on the side, and so what kind of climate zones are we creating? And so the modeling was super helpful to understand zones of full exposure versus more morning exposure or afternoon exposure or full shade. And kind of what you see here is kind of some photographs just 2 years after the implementation of the landscape. So it's still going to grow and still going to transform. But people go, and I think everybody's enchanted by some of the micro scale that can be found in that landscape. And that's part of why the state garden and landscape was often not so well understood until this whole study. And Denver now is kind of the main center for research and knowledge on the state biome in the world. And if you walk by those plants and they're on the ground, you don't even necessarily notice them. But because we lifted everything, and you can see in the center here, you have a raised stone plants with plants growing in it. And the goal of that is to present plants as if they are jewel, make them very special. When you walk by something, it's more at your hand level, you do relate to it a lot more different way. So the purpose of this garden was to address all of those scales and make sure that whoever enters it is kind of slowly find their way charmed and engaged into that space. Here are some more images, and it will continue to evolve. This is when it was just installed, so you can see that it looks very dry, but that's kind of one of the aspects of this landscape. And so here I was talking about the shaping of those spaces for the plants to host as much diversity as we could. But the other aspect was making sure that people can really find those niches where they feel safe, comfortable, have a great time, and fall in love with that landscape. So creating places for people to rest, stop. So it's kind of interesting because reflecting back on COVID, and some people were asking, well, what is it going to do to make an urban space safe again, where you can gather? And you realize, well, maybe one of the key ways is making sure that as you move, you always have options to get away, to move around something, to move around a group of people, but also find a lot of different smaller niches for people to rest and find that they're kind of finding themselves in nature or in contact with plants. So I think that would be interesting to think about the evolution of how we craft spaces for people within the gardens. Here's an example of, we wanted something that was really at the scale of a child, and realizing, you could put a sign that says, hey, in the steppe landscape, water is scarce and rare. Or you could do a sculpture where you hide the water and you hear it before you see it. And that little kid is kind of finding that crack in the stone and discovering the spring. And you realize that that's the center of the garden and that's that source of life. So I think, the question from Richard Louvre, why not giving our cities sometimes that sense of magic and discovery and fun, and while having the research right there, and not necessarily thinking that you have to have science and research in one corner, art and beauty in another one, and fun maybe completely out of it. And why don't we start to mesh this So why this mattered to us and the team was that garden is one of the tools along this long journey. So this will try to show the initial research on the top left there, and all it took to learn about that place, the creation of the publication. The garden is almost a publication itself. It's kind of a living collection, one of the tools to inspire people. And what's interesting with this and Plant Select, which is an amazing program they're doing in testing plants, is that now, for example, I'm doing another project with the University of Denver, and it's a campus that used to be all turf with big trees in the middle of it. And through this research and through those gardens, what it has given us a tool to do is to show the university that you don't have to keep doing turf. You could actually transform your landscape to be a lot more resilient and low water demand and all that. And so they let us experiment with it. And it's kind of amazing to see. It was very fun for us to see that some of those places on campus are actually the most successful in attracting people to hang out. People love to stop in those little nodes and feel in contact with a texture that really relates to the place they are in, which is Colorado. So it's kind of fun to see that. We already see some of the effects of the cultural transformation and what it means to do an urban landscape or urban campus in Denver that is relevant to the region and really kind of celebrates where we are and not just try to push that landscape out and completely lose it. And if you think of the impacts of it in terms of pollinators and all that, by not providing plants that sustain those species. So the fact that in the center of the city, you could find a moment of connection to the much broader landscape, I think is kind of a fun story of how to bring that back together. So the third chapter, we talked about the research and science. We talked about the sense of inspiring and creating that emotional connection in the garden between science and art and so forth. And the third chapter I wanted to kind of touch on with you is when gardens like yours start to go outside the fence, and the notion of taking that science, taking that sense of beauty and biodiversity and others that start affecting everybody's life because you're kind of informing even the shaping of the public realm. So I want to share with you a vision we're developing with a wonderful team at the Greater Des Moines Botanical Garden with Kelly Norris and Stephanie Dutela and wonderful board members and all that. So it's been a fun journey working with them. And here you can see in color the location of the Botanical Garden right by the river in the middle of the city. Kind of forgotten a little bit. It's below a highway. It's kind of a tough site. So here it is, and it's kind of it's a new garden, and they have this huge, beautiful conservatory where it's kind of amazing if you think of the winter month in Des Moines, not the most friendly. I was there once on a site visit, and it was literally snowing sideways. Like the snow was not even coming down; it would just go completely under your nose. And really cold and bitter. So people really love and cherish this place for the ability to come in the winter and find something green. And it's very beautiful and humid, and your skin suddenly feels good and you relax. But the garden, as a way of creating first of all, they had to be loud a little bit. They had to show their presence. And so the first phase of the garden was a little bit more formal, as a way of giving a sense of identity to those gardens. And now our work with them was to expand all the way into that woodland on the north and connect to the river as a way of kind of creating that larger connection to the community. So the workshop one, when we work with people, we have a series of workshops, and we always ask, what is this all about? In some ways, you're doing a master plan. What are the key things that we really want to make sure we address and succeed and do well with? And some of the key ones were already at first seem very simple, but how do we engage with the river? The garden is slightly up on the shelf, there's a wall. So it's kind of, even though it's by the river, it's not connected to the river. So that was a huge question. And as we do that, how do we engage with the community? A lot of the people feel like they didn't necessarily go to botanical, they didn't know there was a botanical garden. So some people knew it, but so they were thinking, what are the ways of really creating outreach and connection? And you realize it's not just about inviting people in, it's how do you go out to them? So I think that became an interesting aspect of the plan, and extend the collections and increase visitation. So here is kind of the master plan, the way it's shaping now. And you can, where you see the oval space is kind of where the current garden stopped. And this phase was all about going up into the floodplain and onto steep slopes with woodland, much more of a coarse and rough terrain, and the whole river edge, which was a huge opportunity, and kind of blurs the edge of where the garden begins and where the garden stops. So I think the very exciting about this is like there's a conscious effort to be as porous as possible while keeping something that operates well. We have mostly one point of entry and exit. Here we're opening a second point of entry so people could come in, swipe a card, maybe get a cup of coffee and all this further into the gardens. But the vision was that whole connection from upland, the woodland where the neighborhoods are, how come they have to go all around, cross the highway, and come, how can we make this a lot more porous and engaged to that river edge? And realizing that the way the river has shaped this landscape is not so defined with what just a wall, and the wall being that separation between those two worlds. And so we started to wonder, well, why is there that slope there? Why is this river here? And what it kind of creates a shelf. And we were just wondering what this site was all about. So we realized beyond just connecting to the community and the river, it was really interesting to see that this site in yellow is right at the edge, the southern tip of a huge deposit from the glaciers. And we realized, wow, actually, we can do more with this project. We can actually connect it to a huge, long history of the shaping of that place, and realizing that it's extremely dynamic. The place is not static. The garden is not static. It's in a place that is constantly evolving. And I feel like in some ways for children and everybody to understand that the place we live in is in constant mutation, I think it is helpful as a way of accepting change. It's much harder when you make things feel like whatever you plant is there forever, realizing that climate change is just one more layer of transformation and change, but the planet has always been changing. So I think that the location of this garden is kind of unique, that you can tell and convey and reveal a very rich history in terms of geomorphology and how it affected all of the plant communities associated with it. So this is a little bit too academic maybe, but it just shows that it's just interesting, some of the deposit and the dynamic rivers cutting right through it. So in yellow here, what you see is some of the till plain, the deposits, and the city carving into it, but also the river. The river in some ways was not there. It came after it was deposited, and it's been carving into that soil medium and exposing multiple layers and soil conditions. So those are some of the images that inspired us. But what it led us to do, and working with Kelly Norris in particular, was really such a charming, inspiring, passionate horticulture director there, of thinking of the transit as a way of revealing all those zones of transition that happen from the edge of the water all the way to the upland, and realizing it was not so much about the plan, it was more about recognizing the difference that it does to plant communities as you move 2 feet to the side, 2 feet up. It's always evolving, and there's that sense of transformation. So Kelly, as we were working with this, he was working kind of in parallel and really kind of writing his libretto on the whole stories of those different plant ecologies and how they relate to the dynamics of the landscape. So it was just, what I'm excited about this master plan, it felt like a perfect place of convergence between his research and science and the plants versus society itself, versus us coming with that deliberate intention to be very exploratory and not come up with an easy solution at first, but really kind of understand what the place was about and evolve the vision around what we could find and what Kelly wanted to really do with new plant collections. So why it matters? Well, suddenly you realize it's no longer about creating a garden made of rooms like the French garden, the English garden, the Shakespeare garden, and then the edible landscape. And it's not organized around those programs. It's mostly organized around the topography and ecology, and really enhancing and revealing plant collections that relate to those ecosystems and so forth. Why it matters is that as the city grows and becomes more and more kind of intensified, you realize you need to incorporate those pockets for rain gardens and so forth. So I think the opportunity for this garden in particular is to really inspire the city and demonstrate to people what it means to inhabit that landscape, and not come up with just 30-foot on center trees along the street, but how do you create a landscape that could incorporate some of those fragments like the botanical garden is doing along a long zone of ecology. So I think where they can be so powerful is to really instill a whole new sets of values of what it means to be in Des Moines and the region, and celebrate that texture and incorporate in the city a landscape that is relevant to the region. But also, frankly, for someone just riding their bicycle along the river, feel like, well, I just went through the botanical garden. That's a pretty amazing gift to the community, and what a great way of suddenly becoming part of everybody's life on an everyday basis. So I'm just walking you through some of those key zones that we had highlighted with Kelly: hedgerows versus bioswales, savannas and prairies. And we went, actually it was wonderful, we took some field trips to look at the models, plant condition, and understand what it feels like to move through it. There's something very emotional, tactile, experiential, and that was kind of what he was very interested also in. He called that curating the visitor's experience, and I thought that was kind of wonderful. And that was one of the other lectures actually we were supposed to do this year that I hope we get to do together. So Kelly, if you're here, I just want to say hi. This map conveys, as you move through, what you want to do is weave together all of those different zones and characters and scales and textures, so that people do fall in love with those different plants. And you ever realize if you come early in the spring, you might be driven to a certain area of the garden, and if you come a little bit later that same spring, you might discover something very different. So the dynamic nature of the garden is recognized here with the way we want to weave people through, in and out. And so this model where we always work in models, and you can see what I have behind me relates to that philosophy of thinking the landscape we live in, our place, is very three-dimensional and temporal. So showing here how you go from the more formal garden gestures to something much more immersive into that complex terrain. And this image was really about all this, like going from the center to becoming a catalyst, and how you inhabit the river territory, and how you become a new face onto the city, and hopefully start to kind of finger out into the streets and start to kind of instill a new, much more rich, diverse, resilient landscape for the city of Des Moines. Those are just precedent images that inspired us. Maybe less turf than that, but how people can lounge and enjoy. Actually, those are perfectly almost more than 6 feet apart, so you could almost say you could do social distancing in the landscape in Des Moines safely. But anyway, this is a closing slide with the idea of how you go from research and science to that notion of inspiring inside the garden, to the notion of spilling out and becoming a catalyst for change, and hopefully help promote that sense of resiliency in the landscape we build with our new cities. So this is my closing slide, and I hope we're all in the same room, but I'm opening at this point time for questions, and hope I can answer. Thank you so much for joining me today. Again, my name is Emmanuel Didier, and pleasure working with you.
Well, thank you so much, Emmanuel, for those great comments and ideas and inspirations. My name's Kelly Norris. I'm the Director of Horticulture at Greater Des Moines Botanical Garden. And I think after Emmanuel recorded that and shared that we would be the third and final chapter of that presentation, he asked me if I would moderate just a few questions and some discussion here in the last 10 minutes or so of this presentation. And it looks like we've got some great questions coming in here. Emmanuel, we'll answer them in the order in which they were asked. But the first question comes from Christopher Dunn. It's a really great question. I think you've had a chance to maybe see the text of it, but for everybody's benefit, Christopher is asking, you know, most, if not really all, North American landscapes that are occupied today by modern civilization have an important cultural tradition, a cultural history associated with Native peoples and First Nations. His question is, can this aspect of landscape history be integrated into such designed landscapes as you've talked about today to give an added layer of context and history to these projects?
Everybody, it's wonderful being here. Yes, thank you. You know, I would just take that question reflecting on the process of design, and I think that's a very valid kind of added value to a project. And I would say then what any project should do then is be more inclusive, of including more of the Native Americans, and sometimes it's multiple tribes or multiple cultures in one place, or sometimes it's one main one. I know we had a project in Tucson, Arizona like that, where we were really trying to convey within the city of Tucson some of the stories and the 5,000 years of occupation of that land before the modern man-made kind of city of Tucson. So anyway, yeah, Christopher, I think it's a beautiful question, and I think the only way I would approach this is make sure then we have some of the key leaders or groups or people that are really committed to inhabit that question, be part of the table day one, because we can't be advancing that question without them, you know, being part of it. And I think if you have a series of workshops and where everybody can hear those different stories, and then I think it presents itself as how do you give form to that landscape that can then reveal and embody some of those narratives and stories, so they become part of the fabric of the city, and instead of just brought back in later. I think that it's a beautiful question. Love it.
It was a great question. I think a lot of us today are thinking about sort of decolonizing, and given just the events of this summer, I think there are some rich cultural conversations beginning to happen, as for some uncomfortable conversations beginning to happen within institutions for how we address some of these issues and continue to really serve populations better. We've got a couple more questions here. We've got two that are sort of related a little bit. One from Cynthia asking, do you foresee that formal gardens will be less relevant in the future? And then a question from Emily asking, have you worked in historic gardens and this concept of rethinking and reimagining traditional landscapes in the framework of historic design she cites as being somewhat perplexing. I see those questions as somewhat related in the sense that, you know, we, especially humans of Caucasian descent in the Western world, have sort of imposed a somewhat, some would say, colonial view of the world. We've put up, you know, walls and forts, and we've sort of built a space, imprinted landscapes on the land. And actually, I think we'd really enjoy hearing about your perspective about making place and really about translating landscapes from land, but maybe address also the ideas of working in historic gardens or formal gardens, and just maybe what you see for the future in these areas.
Yeah, you know, that question of formal versus informal is a kind of a question that comes almost like I teach in a school of architecture. That question almost comes day one. Like students, sometimes they wonder, am I going to be someone who designs formal gardens versus not? As if those two things are completely, I think it's very important to remember why formal gardens were made. If you think of way back, medieval ages, and even later in Renaissance, where you lived in a landscape that was drastically different from where we live now, where everything is so connected. And so at the time, there was, I think, a need for order, and a sense that humankind could kind of establish its own kind of natural expression within nature. So creating an alley, something that you can read that intentional line within something much more organized by natural systems. So it came in contrast in a time where I think it was nature as a system was much more pressing upon everybody's day life. Now with air conditioning and all those things, you realize you're very much not so aware even of living in nature. So I think the world we live in today, you could ask, hey, do we still see needs for formal gardens? Well, I think what's challenging, even recently there was a huge storm in Versailles, I think like 10, 15 years ago, and it destroyed a lot of long alleys. Be able to maintain a very long kind of one line of one tree species is just almost no longer relevant, because of when we see of we are at the mercy of beetles here and disease here, and like if suddenly your whole row of trees dies because you chose to only choose one specimen, you're just exposing yourself to ridicule and a huge problem of investing into an infrastructure of shade and a cooling effect for the city that might disappear just 1 year because you got one bad storm or one bad disease. And so that's where I see formal gardens no longer quite responding to the needs of the world we live in. However, the word formal will never disappear because formal is just simple, the word that reflect on assigning a value, a trajectory, or an intention into the landscape. So I think you could still have very much few good, strong lines. And by the way, those are very helpful as a way of revealing things, intentions in the landscape. But yeah, on that note, that's, even though I am a Frenchman, it's kind of, I don't really hope to design what was typically a French garden, simply because I don't think that it aligns with our new values. It's not about demonstrating the power of man over the landscape. Now we almost want to beg the landscape to come back to us.
I think that's a very well-rounded answer. Sarah saying we have 3 or 4 more minutes left. We just had another question come through from Scott, who says, great presentation, Emmanuel. Could you discuss the differences between designing the children's gardens at PSU and the pollinator garden, and how some of the two could be merged to create an even more enriched experience for children and perhaps even their parents as well? Sure.
No, it's funny because, you know, we say this is a children's garden versus a pollinator's garden. Hopefully, yet children will be in both. And I think what I would say is that the children's garden tend to be tailored toward thinking about how to safely immerse children in a way in a garden where they don't have to be supervised and watched for. So that's how they really connect and almost feel like a sense of adventure and being lost. So it's really designed at the scale of children. And actually, what's interesting over the years, some of what I've learned from that are very grounding your design on a sense of experience and immersion. I kind of applied some of that theory to actually, how do adults even, we are all children fundamentally, we haven't stopped one day. It's not because you're turning 18 and you drink your first beer, or maybe even sooner than that, but that suddenly you stop being a child. And I think that falling in love with a place, discovering that sense of like, wow, I saw something I'd never seen before, and maybe I'm the first one. When I see Facebook pictures and all those things, people are still eager to share their fundamental passion for having a sense of having discovered something new. So I feel like what's interesting, the children's garden, the pollinator gardens are side by side. I think they're going to, yes, blur into what we call one arboretum. So I don't know if I've completely answered the question, but I think the values are kind of the same. The techniques are slightly different because you're addressing multiple scales when you do a landscape for all ages. But that sense of giving spaces that are more social oriented versus sense of very discovered spaces and merge and weaves them together, I think is in some ways applies to both. I was actually thinking a lot about that in regard to COVID. There were some questions I was kind of participating with the Celebrate Design, and that was one of the questions, like thinking, are we going to design urban spaces differently now after this? And I think what we discover through all this, it's not like suddenly you're going to find one formula that applies to all, but I think flexibility and diversity is something that always saves us from the worst, because then you always, if one space suddenly doesn't work, well, it's not like you make 30 of those, it's just one of them, and then the others might work better. So I think you just have to think about scales and diversity and so forth. Did I answer the question? No, it's hard because I can't see the face of the person asking the question and whether it's like, I might.
I think that really got to the point of it. We're probably getting down to just the last few moments here, but there was there was a question from Susan, and I think it's a great sort of summative question that you sort of just began to touch on there too. Her question specifically is, do you have any thoughts on U.S. public gardens today learning to pivot in times of crisis from your native European perspective of growing up in countries that were rebuilding themselves in the decades following a tragedy like World War II?
Huh. Well, I think what was very interesting, and a question I brought through that Celebrate Design, I think you realize that the gardens that were really walled in with one entry, when maybe Surford had to close, like, for example, I was working with the Santa Fe Botanical Garden. They had to close their garden, even though if you think about it, during COVID, I mentioned, if you think about it, actually walking outside in a garden would have been maybe one of the most healthy things that most citizens would have been able to do during this time. And so the more maybe those, the gardens, and that was my third chapter, was talking about the work we did together, Kelly, at the Great Des Moines, the more the research and the textures, the diversity, the richness, that plant diversity can spill out of the garden to become part of the everyday people's world. I think that's extremely meaningful. There's actually, you're talking about World War II, there was a beautiful book about gardens as being one of the most fundamental forms of resiliency and fight for freedom. And now in camps, even people were trying to do mini gardens in the back of some of the camps. And I just do think that there's a fundamental need for humankind to be able to plant something and watch it grow. That I feel like in a time of stress like we went through, having gardens being closed was one of the saddest things, I think, because actually people needed gardens even more to find a place of beauty, and seeing growth in the spring was fundamentally hopeful. And so I'm hoping that one thing that could happen is that we stop having all of the garden being closed. I understand some aspects of it need to be enclosed to protect it and care for it, but what if we start to spill more, and what if gardens start to operate even more as partners of city planners and so forth, to distill and let that science flow out of the world. I feel like that could be what I could see as a way of informing the making of more resilient cities.
I could listen to you all day.
Oh yeah.
I'm so sorry, we're about out of time for this. And Emmanuel, thank you so much. Thank you for allowing us to be children in landscapes, and thank you for hitting these incredibly meaty topics. Thank you so much, Kelly, for being on today to facilitate this conversation. I hope folks keep this conversation going as much as possible. You're welcome to take it to the discussion platform and keep discussing with these folks. I'd like to announce a couple of things, including we'd like to thank Didier Design Studio for sponsoring this session today. They are a landscape architecture firm with expertise in all facets of design and planning, and they may be found at didierdesignstudio.com. Coming up at 2:20, I'm going to give these folks their own time zone, 2:20 Central Time, 1:20 Mountain Time. You'll have the difficult choice between 3 more wonderful concurrent sessions. Before we wrap up at the very end of the day, we'll have a very special session to close us out at 4 o'clock Eastern. So I hope you all will join us for the next couple of things. We still have some time left today. Thank you again so much for your presentation.
Thank you. I hope next year we can be together.
We hope so too. Looking forward to seeing you in person.
Thank you all.